Okay, so welcome everybody, and welcome Mr. John Littleton. He's an organisational psychologist. I want to thank you all for making the time to join us for this seminar, which I know will be very insightful. So just a little bit of information, and stop me if I do get anything wrong. Mr. Littleton holds a graduate diploma of applied psychology and a Bachelor of Psychology and Sociology. Throughout his career, John has successfully treated patients suffering from depression, anxiety, PTSD, chronic pain, occupational stress, low self-esteem, bipolar disorder, trauma, grief and loss, and anger management. He is a member of the College of Organisational Psychologists, the Coaching Psychologist interest group, and is a certified workplace trainer and qualified to facilitate the Myers-Briggs type indicator and mental health first aid programs. He is also a qualified supervisor for provisional psychologists. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to you as co-host. If you'll allow me to do that. No, thank you for being here today.
Okay, I'll just get the, hopefully I get the PowerPoint up. No, I'm still not, I don't have the authority. So I'll talk for a second if you could just.
Perfect. I've made you co-host, so you should be able to do it now.
Gotta love the technical stuff, haven't you? Okay. Yep, there we go. And share. Okay, I think we're there now. Excellent. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. As you can see by the top, as she's explained, I'm both a consulting and organisational psychologist. I've been registered since '98. And been doing counselling psychology throughout that time, but I've also been operating as an org psych, doing things like training in areas of psychological issues around the workplace, recruitment, basically fitness for duty assessments in the workplace, and doing workplace surveys for mental health and well-being in the that's sort of my areas that I'm most interested in org psych. Unfortunately, I've been doing Workcover since 2003, and I only say that because it was probably about 18 years longer than I'd like. And that's just more to the nature of Workcover. I mean, I find it most fascinating and challenging, but it's a hard grind. And so today, the topic, the nature of psychological injury and their common causes, is a topic that we're going to basically go through about these factors, which include what is a psychological injury, what are the problems with psychological injuries, what are the common causes, external and internal drivers of psychological injury, what are the workplace contributing factors, what doesn't work in return to work, legal issues associated with psychological injury. And when I say legal issues, I'm not going to be talking as a lawyer because I'm not. I'm just going to talk from a psychological perspective about what I've seen and experienced. And also what isn't a psychological injury from a psychologist perspective, because I don't want to labor too much on those sort of boring stats that come in from Concare and Workcover about X, Y, and Z. I want to put more meat on it than just provide some basic stats. So that's what we'll be doing today. And having said that, here are some boring pieces of information. The first is that when you start to look at psychological injury and what it is, based on the guidelines from Workcover, that a person has experienced or experiences at work a factor, a stressor that contributes or causes an injury, psychological injury, that can be defined in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, number 5, that meets one of the criteria there, which is often sometimes a problem in itself because number 1, doctors will often write depression, anxiety on the Workcover certificate of capacity, which technically isn't a diagnosable disorder. It's not in the DSM as just depression and or anxiety. There are specific criteria within, it's like saying cancer, what type of cancer, you know, and it's the same thing with, so, and it's often because doctors don't have the time to, or the knowledge to really understand the DSM. Also, stress is not something that is part of the DSM. It's only mentioned twice. Acute stress and PTSD PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Other than that, stress cannot be included on a Workcover certificate of capacity because it's not a mental health condition. It might have caused it, but it's not the diagnosis. And again, one of the other problems with psychological injuries are often with physical injuries, a lot of the time there's a specific event which actually causes the problem. Whereas with a psychological injury, a lot of the time, especially things like bullying and harassment and pressure and things like that, workplace pressure, it's not one event. It's often a gradual process of build-up of distress till the person finally decides, that's it, I can't do it no more, and puts in a claim. You won't receive a compensation if your psychological injury is caused by, and here again, psychological injury, another component is the vagueness of the terms. A normal course of an employer taking reasonable action. So you've got two words there, normal and reasonable. And what defines normal and reasonable almost falls into legal terms in terms of what can be defined as a normal course of action and reasonable action. We'll talk a bit more about that later. This includes things like demotion, performance management, retrenchment, or dismissal. And the number of times I've seen and worked with employers where the gone down, they've either disclosed during the performance management or have known that they've got a mental health condition. The employer puts their hands up and goes, we won't do it. We'll just put up with it because I don't want to get myself into trouble. So this is where it gets quite challenging. Why is it a problem? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Number one, if you look at the next dot point, over a 5-year period, the cost or the weekly wage in terms of payment out to the injured worker, so it's twice as much for an injured worker as it is of a psychological injury as it is for a physical injury. So there's a much higher cost associated with psychological injuries. And then if you add on top of that, doctors, psychologists, and a range of other interventions, that cost goes up over physical injury as well. Likewise, they estimate, and this is coming from Workcover, WorkSafe New South Wales, 33% of cases will return in the first 14 days and the cost will go down or, be virtually eliminated. But that still leaves 2/3 of cases that drag on over a prospective period. And if you look at this graph, and this is many years ago, we developed a program called Other Places We Go, and it was 3 of us. There was a occupational, he was often assessing people for return to work, and a manager, used to be a registered nurse, oddly enough, but he was now in sort of senior management. We all had talents in training, despite what you might have today. And we got together and wrote this program called Oh, the Places You Go, which was actually a book from Dr. Zeus. But it was what we call, is often called long tail claims. And you can see them there, and you can see at the top the number of weeks the person's off work versus the number of people, percentage of people put in a claim. And you can see there's this exponential curve going down, and it never quite gets to zero. And you can see round about the 12-week mark, you start to get a flattening out of the curve, where people, once you get to that 12 weeks, the predictive capacity of people returning to work is going down, and it starts to slow to the point where return to work becomes not only very difficult, but for some point, for some people, almost impossible. So these are the problems with psychological, especially psychological claims, that they're hard to define, reasonable action, normal progress of what is a workplace injury, when is it valid, becomes challenging and almost falls into the legal minefield of definitions and things like that, which I won't be focusing on too much today because it ain't my area. Okay, so from Comcare, some of the data they talk about in terms of the common causes of psychological injury include things 50% workplace pressures, which can include the pace of work, the emotional demands of work, the physical demands of work, then bullying and harassment, which makes up about 25% of claims, occupational violence, 10%, exposure to trauma, which, sometimes we think, well, wouldn't that be bigger? Because given, the industries like the firefighters and military and, down here in Wollongong, we have a place called South Coast Private, which is a mental health private hospital. And there's a whole ward set aside for people who are in the military or quasi-military, firefighters, police, around trauma. So I suspect that figure may go up, but it still doesn't represent a major part of psychological, but it is there. And I've just put in others because I did the figures and it added up to 90%. And I think, hang on a second, what's the other 10% doing? And I thought, well, it must be just other bits and pieces. So that's how ComCare starts to look at what the causes of psychological injury are. I used to work with a guy called Dr. Peter Cotton, and maybe some of you heard of him. He's very big at Victoria WorkSafe, and he did a lot of research for ComCare and Workcover around workplace injuries. Unfortunately, he's now died, but he was really forefront in that area of determining workplace injuries. And he was looking at surveys or doing surveys with Melbourne University about what are some of the key issues. And he really broke it down to 3 issues. The first issue, he said, one of the lead issues is leadership, believe it or not, management. And within that, having worked many years in that sort of organisational psych domain, there were 3 leadership styles that became highly problematic. The first was the authoritarian, which are really the bosses that just get very abusive and aggressive and dominating, and you do what I tell you to do, etc., etc., and can create a lot of fear and intimidation. In that style is a major problem. The next one is what we call pressure prompted or pace setter type leaders, where it's just one of those organizations where the organization is there's always the next crisis. There's always the next thing that's going to go wrong. There's always the next thing that has to get done. And employees start to come under a lot of pressure, high pace, high demand, long hours, et cetera, et cetera. I worked for one at one stage. I remember her calling me at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning. And I just said to her, look, I'm not going to do this. Sorry. I finished work at 6 o'clock on Friday. I'll be driving into work at 8 o'clock on Monday, and you call me then. But in the meantime, not talking. I'm sorry, you may not like it, but I'm entitled to have a weekend, and hung up. Which didn't go down well, but that's okay. But they're these high pressure people. They have this pattern of just needing to be on the go, and it flows down to the staff. And then what's called the laissez-faire. And think about laissez-faire managers. They're the ones who are sort of step back and they don't really get involved terribly much, and they're more distant. I didn't think that would be a major problem, except one of the key pieces of research Peter Cotton found was that we have a laissez-faire manager, you also have increased bullying harassment, because where there's a power vacuum, somebody steps in to fill the vacuum, and they're often the ones that are bullies, and they take over, and the manager won't do anything about it, and creates this very toxic work environment. And I remember one of the first things that was ever said to me when I did my org psych training was, show me the nature of your boss, show me the nature of the organization. And that's pretty much true. I found in so many different organizations. So if your leadership, especially the CEO, is not a great leader, it tends to trickle down to the rest of the organization for a variety of reasons. Second issue he found was poor teamwork. Teamwork. And things like peer bullying, low peer support or care, discourteous behavior, gossiping, and being ostracized are classic areas of teamwork and quite toxic. And I don't think I need to explain too much of that, but even things like discourteous behavior, being rude, giving people filthy looks, being grumpy, saying narky things, gossiping behind people's backs, ostracization is a classic one, are all classic areas of teamwork which can cause workplace distress. And then the third one he found were individual factors, which can include individual negative experiences, like having a horrible phone call, somebody who is highly critical, or failing at doing something, or being criticized. And along with that is individual factors, including the person's personal psychological makeup. That is, do they have a pre-existing mental health problem? Known or not known, it doesn't matter. Are they under high stress at work? Therefore, when they come to work, if work is stressful, where's their gap? Where's the freedom? And by the way, with regard to workplace negative experiences, it's not high on the areas of of what causes a psychological injury, because if you have a negative experience, then you have a positive experience, then that positive experience can override the negative experience and counters it. So it's not just, it's when you have negative experience after negative experience after negative experience, that's when it becomes critical. What Peter was really getting at was that there's this thing called workplace morale. And when workplace morale is high, because usually good leadership, good team support, and positive experiences you come out of that because of support from around you. And I remember once I had a really tremendous leader, and one day I was having a crap of a day, and I walked into her office and said to her, I just need to vent. Just let me vent. And for the next 30 seconds, I swore and carried on and stormed around the room. And I calmed down. I just said, and she looked at me with a smirk on her face and said, "Yeah, okay now?" I said, "Yep, fine, thanks," and walked out the door. And that's all it took. So that's what I'm talking about. So where morale is high, we tend to notice that there are less time off work, less sick leave, and less workplace injury. Morale is low, then the reverse, of course, happens. In actual fact, minor events start to lead to things like workplace injuries and Workcover claims and things like that. I just find that's very important in terms of when I'm doing work with organizations and they want to improve the well-being of the workplace and increase performance. I say, that's great. And they'll say, oh, look, we need to build resilience into our staff. And I say, well, that's only 50% of the picture. The other percentage of the picture is how the organization going to build resilience into the organization through good leadership, good teamwork, a good culture, and something Peter Cotton emphasized, which is workplace climate as distinct from cultures. Climate is easier to move than culture. And climate includes things like courteous behavior, supportive people around you, activities that go on within the organization that enhance a sense of well-being and belonging. Okay, moving along. So what are the contributing factors? Well, number one, if you start with managers and leaders, sometimes people are promoted into leadership because they make good widgets. Whatever the core work of the organization is, they make good widgets. They can't go any further in the area of speciality, so they promote them to managers because there's a very strong correlation between making widgets and managing people, of course. Another one is low emotional intelligence, and emotional intelligence can be defined as self-awareness. That is, what am I feeling right now? What am I thinking? How do I manage my thoughts and feelings so I don't dump it on people? What are you feeling and thinking at the moment? And how do I manage what's going on for you to help you? Now, that's a very dumbed down basic view. It's more complex than that. But like IQ, people have an EQ, and managers who high EQ can often cause a lot of problems. Don't realize the power ratio between themselves and their staff. When I'm involved with recruitment and I'm advising on questions, I'll often do it myself or advise the people doing the interview to ask a question. And it's the classic question, tell me about your weaknesses. And I remember once a recruiter saying to me, John, your answer to that is being a workaholic and a perfectionist. And I said, I refuse to answer because it's bullshit, number one. And number two, very few people actually have that issue. I said, the way I will say to people being recruited to management is, tell me about your weaknesses. I don't want to hear perfectionism and workaholic. What I want to hear is what you really know about yourself and also how you manage it. Because you're a manager, there's a power ratio, like a parent to a child, between a manager and a staff member. And there's an old joke in economics that says, if America sneezes, the streets are cold. It's probably China now, but anyway. In other words, if a manager has a quirk or idiosyncratic behavior or a flaw in their personality, which they all do, it gets magnified down to the staff. It's bigger for them than it is for them. And they might not even be aware of it. But a manager who's not self-aware and doesn't do anything about it can cause all sorts of problems down here. And of course, my favorite, because I spend a chunk of my time dealing with it, not because it's frequent, when it happens, it's big, personality disordered manager. Narcissism, especially because narcissists love being in positions of power, gravitate into those roles. Antisocial personality disorder, and there was a study done mid-2000s is by the British Psychological Society, where they surveyed the top 100 CEOs of big organizations, and 48% of them met the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, which is psychopaths and sociopaths. Borderline personality disorder, and not obsessive compulsive disorder, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is different. They're the top 4 that I tend to notice in management cause problems. Human resources, and nothing against human resources. I work with them consistently, but the common complaint about HR is either they're feckless, that is, they don't deal with it. It's not my problem. You work it out as the manager, or they take forever to respond. And so the poor old manager's left dealing with it by himself. They're the meat in the sandwich, which is upper management is imposing draconian processes down. HR once has a permanent belief to staff below are complaining back up again. And this is less frequent, but sometimes you get HR people who are more interested in policies and procedures than they are in people. And so they love the paperwork, not very good with the people stuff. Workplace factors include low levels of autonomy, that is, they're constantly being micromanaged, is another way of putting that. Work pace, which I've talked about before in terms of constantly on the go, and emotional demands. And I've seen that amongst, I did a survey for, what was it? God, I hate when my mind does that. A legal firm in Sydney, a big legal firm who dealt a lot with Legal Aid New South Wales, sorry, couldn't think of it. And they saw a lot of abuse. And of course, the demand on the lawyers of going through pictures and reading stories and things was just horrendous for them. A lot of this stuff comes from something called the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire, which is one of my favorite workplace survey questionnaires, because not only the impact on the people, but it looks at causality as well, and it highlights those 3. Okay, I, as a psychologist, I can't not talk about the personal people stuff. And when I was doing fitness for duties for a number of big organizations, I was often in the fitness for duty, I would gather data from all over the place. One of the things I was looking at, well, what about the person? And I would assess them using a psychological assessment for psychopathology, but then I wanted to look at what was going on underneath them. So I used something called a schema questionnaire, which looks at negative belief systems, or schemas, which are complex negative belief systems. And the 2 most common internalized belief systems were unrelating standards, which is perfectionism. That is, I have to get it at 99% right, or I can't cope, or I think I'm in something with me. And self-sacrificing schema, which is I have to make everybody else around me like me, and if I don't, there's something wrong with me. Other negative belief systems, and I've spent workshops just talking about this topic, but the best way to think about it is there's an external event. You see the external event. I demonstrated that many different ways, but I won't today. Your unconscious brain, which is just the part of the brain that you're not consciously aware of, actually intervenes and adds more information. It interprets that event. And what you experience is the output of that. So 2 inputs, 1 output. What you feel and what automatic thoughts show up in your head are the byproduct of your unconscious mind interpreting the external event. And the 2 most classic ones I see in the workplace are those 2 there, which, if moderated, are fine, because who doesn't like someone who's a perfectionist, and who doesn't like someone who is thinking about other people? But in the extreme version, they cause incredible distress to people. They're not the only ones. There's other negative belief systems. And from the point of view of Workcover, narcissists, borderlines, and obsessive compulsive dominate, like they represent 2 to 3% of the population. But in actual fact, they actually represent much more time. The classic event is I have provisional psychs, and they'll come in and go, oh, I've got this injured worker, and they're just driving me crazy, and I can't get anywhere, and I don't understand what's going on. And I'll say, okay, let's map that and get on the whiteboard and map out the behavior. And then I have an inkling as to what it is. And, I've been working this area for years, so my radar's up pretty quickly for these things. And then I get them to go away and gather more data and come back. And then the number of times for them, it's like, yeah, this is starting to sound like a narcissistic personality disorder or a borderline personality disorder. And I get them to then gather more evidence and then present it to the insurer and say, look, this is what it is. But it's like the 80-20 rule. They may represent 20% of the cases, but they take up 80% of your time. And because they lack self-awareness and they won't take responsibility for their actions by definition, go through multiple doctors, multiple psychologists, multiple case managers, multiple OC rehab providers. They just keep changing and they don't get anywhere. So they really are a major contributing factor. Another one, which I'll quickly go through, another two issues, is that when an injured worker is off work, and I discovered this one day with a client I was working with, and I was wondering why he wasn't moving. Why he seemed to be a very good worker before the injury, but now he's really just bogged down. And I did this little formula, and you can see there in the graph, the table on the right, I broke down his roles as an employee, and this is a predetermined one. I've cut it right down, like it's 3 times the list, all his different roles. And then what I got him to do was assign a value to how important those roles are. 0 is nothing, not important at all. 10 is super important. Then I got him before the injury to rate how well he performed at the role. And you can see it's a maths problem. So you multiply the value, you put on the role times how well you perform it. And that's how you determine self-worth. Self-worth is a combination of 3 things: the roles that you play in your life, your value, how important that is, and how you perform at them. And you can see there's a number 411. It was actually much higher than that, but and then I got him to rate how well performing the role after the injury. And you can see the number drops dramatically because obviously you can't do the roles as well. The values don't change, but the performance changes. And 9 times out of 10, it drops by 2/3. Now you're left with this thing called low self-worth. And it's often a byproduct of being injured and being in the Workcover system. And when you've got low self-worth, you don't think well of yourself and you don't want to be out there. You don't want to, if I'm not worth much, then I don't want to take risks because I feel bad about myself. I don't like myself because I'm not the person I'm supposed to be. And you move into what I call the safe, miserable zone. So some people would want to call it the comfort zone, but it's nothing comfortable about being depressed or anxious. It's the safe, miserable zone. That is, their brain is telling them outside of this zone, everything is dangerous because they're not good enough. So stay inside the safe, miserable zone. Where they're safe, their brain's telling them you're not going to get into trouble now, but they're miserable because they've given up on life. And this is often the most leading factor with people who are struggling to go back to work, is that they're stuck in the low self-miserable zone because they have a very low sense of self-worth. What doesn't work in returning to work? Common factors: antagonistic or non-communicative employer. Think about this. If you're depressed, it may be a physical injury, could be a psychological injury, but you're experiencing low self-worth or depression, and the employer isn't talking to you, and it's not your fault that you're injured. How do you, if you've got depression, how are you going to think about yourself? My employer's not talking to me. 9 times out of 10, the injured worker's going, they don't care, or they're blaming me, or they don't want me back. And they're sitting at home by themselves, that negative self-belief system ruminating through their head, and it just antagonizes the person's psychological well-being. Also, all or nothing thinking with the employer. You either come back to full duties or you're back. No graduated return to work, whereas the research says graduated return to works are far more effective. Delayed psychological intervention. Your brain is what we call homeostatic. That is, whatever you're experiencing over a period of time, your brain starts to normalize that. We're doing it all the time. We normalize workplaces, we normalize family relationships, we normalize it, and our brain adjusts. The chemistry and wiring of the brain adjusts to say this is normal. And the person who has this psychological problem, more the brain starts to believe that's normal. And worse, because of perception problems, we start to look for information to back up the current state and will ignore information that contradicts what we believe. This happens universally across all sorts of things. Talk to a conspiracy theorist about it. But ultimately, the longer a person stays depressed, or low self-worth, the more the brain chemistry changes to adjust to it, and therefore harder it is to get change. My old joke, this is just one of my quotes. If an injured worker has been in Workcover for more than 6 months, if they didn't have a mental health problem when they started, they'll have one by now. And that's just the nature of Workcover. One size fits all approach, an adversarial model within Workcover. And sees them as malingerers because has determined the difference between three categories: the really good ones that want to come back quickly, the obvious skaters who are serpentining, they're anxious, they're nervous, but we can get them there, and the ones that are actually stubbornly refuse and working and malingering and working hard not to go back to work. And how do you tell the difference between those two types? And for the insurer, it's just easy to look at them as malingerers and become quite aggressive towards them. Injured workers has no or limited understanding of their rights and responsibilities. And I get an injured worker in my office for the first time, and I sit down with them, and one of the questions I ask is, what's going on? 9 times out of 10, they don't. They have no idea no paperwork, no information provided. Sometimes nothing gets doctors, but some doctors, I remember the physician in Canberra used to talk about doctor shopping, where malingerers, especially people who are trying to milk, literally go and find a doctor who really is just a receptionist or a secretary. What do you want me to write down a certificate? Fortunately, not many of them, but they are out there. Or the doctor only takes the advice of the injured worker as if that's the truth, which can happen with psychologists as well, where they're not looking at the broader picture. Multi rather than interdisciplinary approach to treatment, this is one of the biggest complaints, is that the difference between multidisciplinary fellows, a doctor, psychiatrist, physiotherapist, psychologist, OC rehab provider, and silos. And there's very limited communication. Whereas interdisciplinary, so we all get in the room, we all discuss the injured worker and what everybody else is experiencing and come to an agreed approach to helping the injured worker. Treating the injured person, I remember a very clinical psych who worked for Workcover saying, Southern Cross University done some research about Workcover and said the problem is that the insurer sees the injury and ignores the person. And if they looked at the person holistically, there would be a much better return on investment. Again, emphasizing here just very quickly, we're nearly finished. If you look at these 3 scenarios, again, I'm not talking, this is just what I got off the Comcare website. In one of the key decisions on psychological injury, it's on the website, so I'm just using what's there. An injured worker claimed harassment and racial vilification, and disciplinary action was taken against them in relation to conduct at work. The SDA denied that they were vilifying or racially slurring the person. Many co-workers denied it as well. So they denied it. They talked to co-workers, said, no, that wasn't happening. The claim of harassment and racial vilification shouldn't have got up, but it did based on one factor. There was a sign put up for a while that was racially slurring. And the injured worker felt that they were being racially vilified based on the sign that was up, and the claim got up based on that. That's just one piece of information. And even though you look at what's written and go, yeah, they shouldn't have got the claim up, they did based on that. And it wasn't just the fact that the person actually was racially vilifying them. It was the perception of the injured worker that it was enough to get the claim up. In the second one, clients accepted prepared meal. A person who prepared the meals for aircraft passengers, sustained a psychological injury, the claim and declined liability on the claim when it was taken to court, because they were claiming it was reasonable action. They were disciplining the injured worker. The claim got up because even though there was an investigation done by Qantas, which is always suspect when they do, an organisation does its own investigation, but basically I'm going to have to read it from here, but that the employer has no intended to, even though the employer had no intention to cause psychological harm, the worker may have perceived the event and action in the workplace very differently. So again, when it went to the tribunal, it's the perception of the injured worker that plays a much more important role, or a significant role, rather than simply what the employer says they did. My own experience of this was many years ago when I was working with a Telstra worker, and I'll keep this brief. Basically had one role. The Telstra was downsizing, remember they were doing for a long period of time. He kept being he'd keep his role. And over about 6-month period, 5 times he said, no, you're safe. Then on the 6th occasion, they said, sorry, we're going to have to demote you into another role because we don't have that role, so you can do this. And he was very upset, and he put in a Workcover, a Comcare claim in this case. And when I interviewed him in the initial assessment, basically, my approach was, what is it that in your current role is causing you the distress? And he couldn't come up with something. And what I didn't know is I used to work in electronics, and I knew the role, and I simply stepped him through the role, and he couldn't answer it effectively. So when I rang Telstra and said, look, this isn't a Workcover claim, this isn't a Comcare claim, this is a HR problem. If HR had managed this properly, they should never have got to Workcover. And it was just one of those cases where sometimes injured workers, and you can see at the bottom point there, want to punish the employer, and Workcover or Comcare is the last port of call where they feel like they're not being listened to, and they want to punish the employer, so they're putting in a claim. So when that, this should have been managed by HR. So that really, from a psychological perspective, should never be a Workcover claim or Comcare claim, is when the employer, injured worker, or the worker is not happy about a decision made by the company. Stress, as I said, is not a claim in itself. It has to be a DSM diagnosed disorder, where performance management is done with reasonable adjustment is included. So you can performance manage someone with a mental health condition if you get appropriate advice from HR and org psychs on how to do it. And where a person is breaching duty of care. So one of the important things here is in the guidelines for workplace wellbeing, work health and safety, is that duty of care is an immediate dismissible offence. So this is where often catching people with personality disorders, because they'll often breach duty of care. They breach ethical guidelines within the workplace. Personality disorders, it's an interesting one. I won't have time to discuss it in detail, but obviously when I see someone with a personality disorder and they've put in a claim, which they often do, there's 2 things. One, it's obviously a pre-existing injury. You can't develop a personality disorder from a workplace injury. You've already got it. It's pre-existing. That needs to be something that has legal ramifications to it. Number 2 is it has huge costs to the organization. People with personality disorders, when they're recruited, especially upward people, always schmoo, always brown nose upwards, because they want to be up there. To people at their level, they'll often sabotage so they can get above them, and people below them simply become their personal staff. They do whatever they want them to do, and they treat them fairly badly. So personality disorders have huge costs to organizations because they often create a toxic staff. So I go, well, about 10 minutes over. Apologies for that. I hope that was useful. As was said before, it'll be up on you can download, you can go over the information. I moved fairly quickly, and apologies for that. But I hope that gives you some background information and some useful information regarding psychological injury. Thank you very much. I'll hand it over to
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. Really appreciate it. So now that very insightful seminar has come to an end, we are now going to take questions. I saw that there were a few questions in the chat. If you would like to ask a question, now is your time to do so. I think there might be some more questions coming in now. So if you'd like to ask a question, please unmute yourself. It'd be good if you could do that one at a time. Thank you. And ask your question, and Mr. Littleton will be happy to answer them for you.
gone very quiet, haven't they?
Always ends up like this. I believe
I
there
know.
was a Gabrielle who had a question before in the chat. Gabrielle, are you still here? Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, sorry. John, I was wondering, do your IME assessments are only for work cover claims, or do you do other areas of PI like MVA or abuse law?
I don't do IMEs in the official title of IME because I'm not a psychiatrist, but I do fitness for duty and psychological assessments of fitness for duty. So I do those basically. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. So I don't do stress claims in the sense of investigating work, not just workers. The work cover system, I'll have have a few companies that come to me and say, we've got this person, they're not performing well, we probably need to do a fitness for duty or a independent psychological assessment to determine what we need, sometimes what we need to do to help this person stay at work. So that's the sort of things I primarily do.
I have a question as well, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
I was wondering if you have much experience or on if the psychological injury comes from the nature of the work rather than the workplace. So, and how that kind of works with work cover and stuff as well. So if the content that you're kind of consuming at work in the case I work in is abuse, childhood abuse, how that, I guess, works with who's liable if you go into the job knowing that that's the job you're doing. Is the workplace still have a responsibility?
Absolutely. As I said to you a number of years ago, Legal Aid New South Wales came to the organisation I was working for and I wanted to do a survey. They'd done a survey in 2001 of the workplace wellbeing, and it was in the toilet for a variety of reasons. And they wanted to do the CEO had been asked to come back and come in and improve that. And 7 or 8 years later, I think it was, our organisation came in and I sort of headed up the approach, and they did the Copenhagen psychosocial questionnaire, which was about 26 names, and I think 19 of them are the drivers of workplace distress. And one of the really strong drivers was emotional. And because they were looking at, you know, child sexual abuse, domestic violence, and a whole range of things, they had to read documentation outlining what was going on. They had to look at the images that the police were providing, and it was quite distressing for a number of them. And so one of the things I had to address in my report was to say, and there were a number, my favorite one was the fact that some of the lawyers had 2-week contracts. And I remember one lawyer saying, you know, I packed my bags on Friday, put it in my box, was walking out the door, and the boss came and said to me, what are you doing? He said, I'm leaving. Contract's over. She said, no, extend it for another 2 weeks. Outside of that sort of stuff, yeah, the emotional demands, cognitive demands sometimes, trying to digest a lot of information very quickly and getting overwhelmed with the content. So cognitive demands, emotional demands, often very, not so often very common, they do exist as psychological stressors and are still the responsibility of the employer. Just to name, workplace is another one, which I think I talked about before, which is that you just jump from one thing to the next thing to the next thing because of the nature of the role the person's in, which leads them to become highly distressed. So there's 3 straight off the top of my head, which are the nature of the job that are the responsibility of the employer. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah, that was really helpful.
Wonderful. It looks like we have a question in the chat from Katie, whose microphone isn't working. John, she wanted to know what can be done as early intervention to mitigate the length of claim and assist with recovery at work.
There's a lovely little, you can look it up. It's called the FLAG system. It was developed in the 1990s by a couple of New Zealand guys. And it was an early intervention, and it was called FLAG system. And there were 4 flags. red flags which are medical. There's things that people flag, like a flag to highlight there's something else going on. And there are a list of red flags which are medical. Yellow flags were psychosocial. And they developed, and they're about 3 times the list of the red flags. And it was all the patterns you could look at. I think it was Kendall 97. It's Kendall, I can't remember what it was 97. Called the flag system. And I've literally got a checklist of, and I'm happy to send it to MAG if they would like it, and they can distribute it, which is an early intervention looking for flags that could lead to complex cases. So that'd be the number one easy one, just to say I can send it to MAG, they can send it somewhere, people can download it. But yeah, that's my, and the blue flags were employer-employee relationship issues. I think black flags were system-related flags. So that'd be my answer to that one. I'm happy to provide it if it's so desired.
Wonderful. We have another question from the chat here saying, do you have any good books, resources, or references on good leadership?
Yes. I run workshops on something called social leadership. I could spend, again, another day talking about leadership. And because leadership has often been drilled down to personality inventories, what personality makes a good leader, which has very evidence to be effective in recruitment or anything else. Books on Gandhi and Winston Churchill. And so we look at that and go, Winston Churchill was this and Gandhi was that. But again, it's too to the idiosyncratic and too much related to the time and place to be a generic. What the research is telling us, and this is there I've stumbled into, I really love it, is I run workshops on leadership called social identity leadership. And there's plenty of research on it. There's a university in Australia, it's big, I think it's in Queensland. I think Macquarie University has also been involved with it. There's a couple in England and America. And social identity leadership differs because it's performance-based and it's skills-based. In other words, they're attributes that can be developed by leaders. The research shows that these 4 basic processes that are built into social identity theory, which then leads into social identity leadership. And social identity theory is simply the idea, in our Western society, you think you're an individual who acts as an individual based on your personality and whatever else. When in actual fact, there's plenty of research to show, based on things like conformity, that your attitudes and beliefs will change based on the people around you. The old saying, it's hard to fly like an eagle when you're surrounded by turkeys. It's a bit like that, but more sophisticated. And social identity leadership, which is you can get on YouTube, you can read about it, you can find research articles on it, is to me one of the best models of leadership and leadership development I've ever seen. So hopefully that answers that question.
Wonderful. Do we have any more questions from the crowd? I think Maddie asked something in the chat. Maddie, are you still there to ask this yourself? Okay, I can just see that Maddie, if, oops, she said she's struggling with the mic. So Maddie's just said, would you mind please discussing how pre-existing psychological injuries such as, pardon me, schizophrenia or bipolar disorder can interact with workplace-related injuries, and what sort of support should be expected for such workers? And she said, thank you so much.
Okay, well, yes, nice to thank you before we've actually answered the question. That puts the pressure on. Yeah, look, I mean, I've had experience with people with schizophrenia. It's fairly rare, and bipolar a bit more common. More likely it's going to be depression and anxiety. Basically, one of the hard things is you cannot not recruit a person based on a mental health condition. You have some sort of clearance, like the military does, to assess people mentally before they recruit them because they're going to have a gun. Technically, you're not allowed to discriminate against. I mean, it does happen, but you're not allowed to discriminate against people with mental health conditions. Problem becomes, and this is how Peter Cotton picked this up very nicely. if a person has a pre-existing mental health problem and the first port of call of defense about not letting it turn into an injury, a psychological injury, is that workplace morale. If leadership is good, teamwork is good, become inoculators to individual mental health problems. So I remember back in '97, the World Health Organization did a survey on work happiness. And the number one predictor of workplace happiness was not the income, it wasn't even the role, it was the people that are around you, your team. Given you spend 8 or more hours at work, they're another family. And if that is a good family, then it reduces the risk of mental health, or at least a pre-existing mental health problem being exacerbated. And of course, the opposite is true. And in Peter Cotton's case, it was about morale. The measurable, definable measurement of workplace resilience was morale. As I said, leadership, teamwork, individual factors come in there, but the other two mitigate it. That's number one. Number two is if a person discloses or exacerbates a mental health problem, bear in mind that according to the latest ABS statistics from last year, 20% of the Australian population have a diagnosable mental health disorder, regardless of whether they know they've got it or not. It's just, that's about the number, and it's probably a little on the low side. But they also estimated that another 20% of people in Australia have risk factors for a mental health problem. That is, they're not diagnosable, but they're having problems, which can then quickly lurch into one, especially if things like home or work-related stresses occur. If they do occur, early intervention is probably the first step, which is to have EAP as not just a tick box to say, oh, we've got that, but to actually have a good EAP provider, and that's a thing in itself, and to have regular seminars around workplace wellbeing and things like good HR departments that can, even have people referred to HR to say, have a quick chat about what's going on and do workplace adjustments. One of the classics is, workplace performance management, where often you see this pathway of performance starting to drop. So who's noticing that? Who's noticing the performance dropping? And performance usually doesn't just drop. It usually goes up and then down and then up, but the average, the mean is slowly dropping. Who's picking that up early? Who in the staff around them or the manager is going, oh, they're not acting their normal self. Maybe we need to do something. We need to get HR involved. We need to get EAP involved. Some rehab providers now providing psych early investigation assessments, not before Workcover claims are done, to try and catch it early when someone says this isn't right, or the person puts up their hand and gets them assessed and works out what's going on and puts the interventions in place. So for me, number one is that morale. Number two is having people, good EAP providers, and having people having regular seminars and interventions and education around what, mental health first aid is a good one, but there are shorter versions that where people have self-awareness. And the attitude of the organization isn't that mental health is buried and forgotten and ignored, but that people can talk about it and get the appropriate help. And early intervention like the flag system and things like that, early recognition. The people caring and noticing are probably the two sort of lead, comes back to work climate and culture, the best ways of prevention. Prevention is first, early intervention is second, rehabilitation is last, because it's the most costly and the slowest to recover. Workcover is really the rehabilitation. I hope that answers the question. Just checking, did that answer the question for that person?
Thank you, John. We have another question from Amy in the chat. Following on from the above, I'm seeing a lot of requests for DBT for the treatment of work-related injuries. Do you think this appropriate, and or is there a place for this treatment types in the workers' comp scheme?
DBT was developed by, I think her name was Lindemann, Michelle, can't remember what it is, for borderline personality disorder. And it was much more in depth and holistic than CBT. And it's a good therapy, but it was originally developed as a group process. That is, a group of people in a clinical setting with a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a social worker, and there was a whole bunch of intervention, particularly for borderline, because of the incredibly distressing and challenging nature of the diagnosis. It's now, as many disorders do, treatments do, branches out to other people with severe depression or anxiety, and it can work well for that too, though the research is not as solid in those areas simply because it was focused more on borderline personality disorder, but it's used often for those really tricky and difficult cases. And so, yes, it should be used for things, an individual psychologist or social worker or counsellor using DBT as a main form of treatment, as a standalone treatment, can be quite helpful, but it wasn't the way it was originally designed. So it has check balances in it. So yes, it should be, along with other treatments. Doctors always write CBT, and CBT, yes, it's good and there's a lot of good solid research, but I use, when I'm working, like the OMO ad, hard to remove stains, use OMO. Well, for me, the hard to remove psychological statements is I'm using things like internal family systems and schema therapy, which dig deep. It's like the surgeon's pulling the guts out and, deep internal, whatever, they're getting in there and they're fixing it at the core. To me, DBT can do that. Schema therapy can do that. Internal family systems can do that. It's not all one size fits all. ACT and CBT, excellent, I particularly still use, DBT, short answer, DBT in the right circumstances can be a very effective therapy.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Are there any more questions to be asked? Anybody in the chat? Anybody here in the video session live? I will take that as everybody is finished with questions. Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you everybody again. Just letting you know that this recording will be available. There'll be a link to the YouTube video sent out in the days coming. I saw a few people asking for the slides as well. So they will be sent out as well, and maybe some of the information that John mentioned could be sent through to, if that's something that you guys want. So thank you so much, everybody. I'll stop the recording now.